My name is Catherine. I'm 34 years old and I am a state Supreme Court justice. But my sister didn't know that when she snapped her fingers at me in the courthouse lobby and told me to fetch her a coffee. The smell of the King County Courthouse was exactly as I remembered it, a distinct mixture of lemon floor wax, damp wool coats, and anxiety. It was a scent that usually made people nervous, but to me, it smelled like clarity, like home. I shook the Seattle drizzle off my umbrella and stepped through the metal detector. The security guard, a burly man named Marcus, who had been working this entrance since I was a public defender, nodded at me. "Morning, ma'am," he grunted, glancing at the plastic ID card clipped to my lapel. He didn't recognize me, not yet. The photo on the ID was new, and the title underneath my name, Justice Catherine Davis, was in a font too small to read from where he stood. "Good morning, Marcus," I said, a small smile playing on my lips. He blinked, surprised I knew his name, but waved me through. That was the story of my life, really. I was the furniture, the background noise. In a family of peacocks, I was a beige wall. I checked my reflection in the glass of the directory case. 34 years old, Caucasian with straight, honey blonde hair pulled back into a severe, no-nonsense low bun. I was wearing a generic beige pantsuit I'd bought off the rack at a department store. It was clean, professional, and entirely forgettable, just the way I liked it. My family thought I was a clerk, or maybe a paralegal. To be honest, I stopped correcting them 3 years ago. When my older sister Vanessa asked if I was still pushing papers for the big guys, I just said yes. It was easier than explaining the grueling hours, the political maneuvering, and the sheer weight of the responsibility I now carried as the youngest appointee to the state Supreme Court. Today was my first day sitting on the bench in my hometown for a special circuit session. And of all the cases on the docket, the universe had a sick sense of humor. Real estate versus city zoning board. The lead developer, my brother-in-law, which meant Vanessa would be here. I tightened my grip on my leather briefcase. Let them think I'm invisible, I told myself as I walked toward the elevators. In about an hour, everyone in this building was going to see me very clearly. I needed caffeine. The nerves were starting to hum beneath my skin, a low-frequency vibration that I had learned to channel into focus. I steered myself toward the courthouse cafeteria in the basement. It was a cacophony of clattering trays, the hiss of industrial espresso machines, and the low murmur of lawyers negotiating plea deals over stale bagels. I joined the back of the line, pulling my tablet from my bag to review the precedent for the zoning case one last time. I was so absorbed in the screen that I didn't hear the stilettos approaching. They hit the linoleum floor with a sharp, aggressive rhythm. Click, click, click. That demanded attention. "No, I don't care what the contractor says. Tell him to rip it out. If it's not Italian marble, I don't want it." I froze. I knew that voice. It was pitch perfect, nasal, and dripping with entitlement. I looked up just as a woman in a pristine white designer trench coat breezed past the queue of people waiting. She was wearing oversized sunglasses indoors, and her chestnut hair was blown out into perfect glossy waves. Vanessa. She stopped right next to me, still holding her phone to her ear. She didn't look at me. She looked through me. To her, I was just a body occupying space she wanted. "Hold on," she said into the phone, then lowered it, finally turning her head. She lowered her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose. Her eyes scanned my beige suit, my sensible shoes, and my lack of jewelry. A smirk curled the corner of her perfectly lined lips. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with mock surprise, "look who it is. I heard you were in town, still shuffling papers for minimum wage." I opened my mouth to speak, to say, "Actually, Vanessa, I'm presiding over your husband's case today." But she didn't give me the chance. She glanced at the long line behind me, then at the counter ahead. "God, this line is a nightmare," she sighed, checking her gold watch. "My husband's lawyers are taking forever upstairs, and I am absolutely parched." She stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was overpowering, choking out the smell of burnt coffee. "Since you're already in line," she snapped her fingers near my face to get my focus, "be a dear and grab me a skinny vanilla latte, extra hot, and don't let them burn the milk like last time." My grip on my tablet tightened until my knuckles turned white. "Vanessa, I'm not—" "Just get it, Kath," she interrupted, digging into her designer clutch. She pulled out a crisp $20 bill and shoved it into the breast pocket of my blazer, patting it condescendingly. "Don't make me late. Bring it to Courtroom 4 when you're done. You know where that is, right? Or do you need a map?" Without waiting for an answer, she turned on her heel, put the phone back to her ear, and resumed her conversation about Italian marble. "I'm back. Yeah, just dealing with some slow help. Anyway." She walked away, the white coat billowing behind her like a cape. I stood there, the heat rising in my cheeks. People in line were staring. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the $20 bill. It felt dirty in my hand. I looked at the menu board, then at the exit. I took a deep breath, pocketed the money, and stepped out of the line. "Next!" the barista yelled. I walked past the counter and headed straight for the service elevators. Vanessa wanted me in Courtroom 4. Fine, I would be there, but I definitely wasn't bringing the coffee.
The judge's elevator was a sanctuary of silence. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off the noise of the lobby, I leaned my head back against the cool metal wall. I could feel the $20 bill burning a hole in my pocket. It wasn't just money, it was a receipt of my sister's contempt. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, the air was different. It was still and smelled of lemon polish and old paper. This was the restricted corridor, accessible only to staff and the judiciary. I walked down the hall, the sound of my heels muffled by the thick maroon carpet. I reached the door marked Chambers, Courtroom 4. I swiped my keycard. The light blinked green, and the lock disengaged with a heavy, satisfying thud. Inside, the room was dimly lit and lined with shelves of legal encyclopedias that probably hadn't been opened since the 90s. But my eyes went straight to the coat rack in the corner. Hanging there, shrouded in plastic from the dry cleaners, was my robe, the heavy black polyester blend that transformed me from Catherine, the little sister, into the state of Washington. I reached out and brushed my fingers against the fabric. Not yet. First, I had to check the layout. It was my first time in Courtroom 4, and I hated surprises. I needed to know the sightlines, check the microphone height, and ensure the clerk had the correct case files on the bench. I left my briefcase on the desk and smoothed down my beige blazer. I took a deep breath, composing my face into a mask of neutral, professional detachment. I wasn't the sister anymore. I was the process. I pushed open the heavy oak door that connected the chambers directly to the courtroom. The noise hit me instantly, a wall of murmurs, shuffling papers, and coughing. The gallery was packed, standing room only. I stepped out from behind the privacy screen, still in my beige suit, moving toward the clerk's station to the right of the high bench. The court clerk, a young man with thick glasses, looked up and started to stand, recognizing me. I gave him a sharp, subtle shake of my head. "Don't," my eyes said. "Not yet." He understood and sat back down, though he looked confused. I reached for the microphone on the bench to adjust the gooseneck arm. That's when I felt eyes on me, prickling, hostile eyes. I looked down into the front row. Vanessa was there, legs crossed, tapping a manicured nail against her knee. When our eyes locked, her expression shifted from boredom to pure, unadulterated outrage. She stared at my empty hands, then up at my face, her eyes narrowing into slits. She didn't see a judge preparing her bench. She saw an incompetent assistant who had forgotten her latte.
The courtroom was a theater, and my sister had just decided it was her opening night. Most people instinctively whisper in a courtroom. The high ceilings, the mahogany paneling, the presence of the flag, it all commands a certain hushed reverence. But Vanessa didn't do reverence. She did volume. She stood up abruptly, her chair legs screeching against the parquet floor. The sound cut through the low hum of conversation like a gunshot. Heads turned. The defense attorney, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit, stopped mid-sentence. "Are you serious, Catherine?" Her voice wasn't a whisper. It was a projection, pitched perfectly to reach the back rows. I stood near the court reporter's desk, my hand still hovering over the microphone check. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just watched her. "I gave you $20, Vanessa announced, stepping out into the aisle. She threw her hands up, the white trench coat flaring dramatically. It was one simple task. One, get the coffee. Bring it here. How hard is that?" The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a car crash. The stenographer stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys, mouth slightly agape. "Vanessa," I said, my voice low and even, "sit down." "Don't you tell me to sit down," she snapped, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You're embarrassing yourself. Look at you, wandering around the judge's bench like you own the place. Do you have any idea how important this hearing is for my husband? We don't have time for your incompetence." She turned to the gallery, seeking allies in her outrage. "She's my sister," she told the room at large, offering a laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Can't even get a latte order right. This is why she's still an assistant at 34. The opposing counsel looked at me, then at Vanessa, and then down at his shoes, his face flushing pink with second-hand embarrassment. The bailiff, a tall man named Officer Miller, took a heavy step forward, his hand dropping instinctively to his belt. He looked at me, waiting for the signal to remove her. I held up a hand slightly. "Wait." "You know what?" Vanessa huffed, crossing her arms. "Keep the $20. Consider it charity. Just get out of the way before the actual judge gets here and throws you out." The air in the room seemed to vibrate. She had said it. She had dug the hole, jumped in, and was now actively shoveling dirt on top of herself. I looked at the clock on the wall. 9 a.m. exactly. "You're right, Vanessa," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "The judge is here." I turned my back on her and walked toward the heavy oak door I had just come through. "Where are you going?" she called out, her voice shrill. "Don't you walk away from me." I didn't stop. I pushed the door open and stepped back into the shadows of the chambers. The moment the heavy door latched behind me, the chaos of the courtroom was severed. I was back in the sanctuary of the chambers. My heart wasn't racing. It was slowing down, settling into a cold, rhythmic thrum. I walked to the coat rack and took the hanger. The robe was heavy, made of a dense, opaque material meant to obscure everything underneath. It was a garment designed to erase the individual and leave only the authority of the law. I slipped my arms into the wide, billowy sleeves. The fabric settled onto my shoulders like a mantle of iron. I zipped the front, the sound sharp and final in the small room. The beige suit, the assistant attire, disappeared completely. I walked to the small mirror above the wash basin. I didn't see Catherine the sister or Catherine the disappointment. I saw Justice Davis. I adjusted the yoke of the robe so it sat perfectly straight. I smoothed back a loose strand of hair. Through the thick oak door, I could hear the muffled sounds of the courtroom. The low murmur of the crowd was growing louder, agitated. Vanessa was likely still holding court of her own, complaining to anyone who would listen about the terrible service. I moved to the door and placed my hand on the brass handle. I waited. I knew Officer Miller's timing was impeccable. He would give me exactly 60 seconds to robe up. I counted down in my head. 3, 2, 1. Right on cue, the bailiff's voice boomed from the other side, loud enough to penetrate the oak. All rise. The shuffling of feet was instantaneous. The murmurs died out, replaced by the collective rustle of clothing as 200 people stood up in unison. I turned the handle. I pushed the door open and stepped out. The transition was blinding. The overhead lights of the courtroom seemed brighter now, reflecting off the polished wood of the high bench. I didn't look at the gallery yet. I kept my eyes on the steps leading up to the chair, my chair. I ascended the 3 steps, the black hem of my robe swishing softly against the wood. I moved with deliberate slowness, placing my binder on the desk, adjusting the microphone, and finally looking up. I was now the tallest person in the room, and I was looking straight down at the front row.
The view from the bench is different than from anywhere else in the courtroom. It's designed that way, to make you feel detached, objective, and frankly, powerful. I scanned the room. The lawyers were standing ramrod straight. The clerks were frozen. And then there was Vanessa. She was standing in the front row, halfway between a slouch and a pose. Her mouth was slightly open, as if she had been in the middle of a sentence when the "all rise" command came. She was looking at the empty space near the clerk's desk where Catherine, the assistant, had been standing just moments ago. Then her eyes drifted up to the bench. It happened in slow motion. I saw the exact moment her brain tried to reconcile the 2 images. She blinked once, twice. Her gaze locked onto my face, then dropped to the black robe, then back to my face. The color drained from her skin so fast it looked like a magic trick. She went from a flushed, angry pink to a sickly, waxen gray. Her hand, which had been resting on the back of the bench in front of her, slipped off. "Oh," she whispered. It was barely a sound, but in the dead silence of the room, it carried like a scream. The crowd realized it too. They looked from Vanessa, the woman who had just spent 5 minutes screaming at the help, to me, the Supreme Court Justice sitting in judgment. The collective realization sucked the oxygen out of the room. Someone in the back row actually gasped. It was a sharp, audible intake of breath that signaled the penny had dropped. Vanessa's knees seemed to give out. She sank back into her seat, not because she was sitting down, but because her legs could no longer hold her upright. She clutched her designer bag to her chest like a shield. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply adjusted my reading glasses, perched them on my nose, and leaned forward into the microphone. "Be seated," I said. The sound of my voice, amplified and booming through the courtroom speakers, made Vanessa flinch physically. She looked around wildly, as if searching for an exit, but she was trapped in the front row, pinned by the stares of 100 people who had just witnessed her social suicide. I opened the binder in front of me. The crisp snap of the metal rings echoed through the silent room. "Calling case number 4920, I read, my voice steady. "City Zoning Board versus Miller Development." Vanessa's husband's lawyer, who was standing next to her, looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. He shot a terrified glance at Vanessa, then at me. He knew. Everyone knew. The silence in the room was heavy, pressurized by the sudden shift in power. Mr. Henderson, my brother-in-law's attorney, stood up. He was a seasoned litigator, usually brimming with arrogance, but now he looked like a man trying to defuse a bomb with trembling hands. He buttoned his suit jacket, cleared his throat, and avoided making eye contact with the woman sitting next to him. "May it please the court," he began, his voice cracking slightly on the first word. "We are ready to proceed with the motion to dismiss." I let him stand there for a moment, sweating under the fluorescent lights. I could feel the weight of the robe on my shoulders, a physical reminder of the distance between where I sat and where my sister sat. "One moment, counselor," I said. My voice was calm, amplified clearly through the room. I took off my reading glasses and set them on the heavy oak desk. I turned my gaze slowly, deliberately toward the front row. Vanessa was staring at her lap, picking at a loose thread on her designer coat. She looked small. For the first time in my life, she looked incredibly small. "Before we begin," I continued, "I want to address the gallery regarding courtroom decorum." Vanessa froze. Her hand stopped picking at the thread. "This is a court of law," I said, my eyes boring into her. "It is not a cafe. It is not a social club. Abuse of court staff, regardless of their title or rank, will not be tolerated in my courtroom." I paused to let the words sink in. "And for the record," I added, my voice dropping an octave, deadly serious, "the bench does not fetch coffee." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the back of the gallery, quickly stifled. Vanessa turned a shade of red I had never seen before, a deep, blotchy crimson that clashed violently with her white coat. She didn't look up. She couldn't. "Is that understood?" I asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Henderson said, quickly, practically bowing. "Completely understood. Proceed." I put my glasses back on and opened the file. As the hearing went on, the transformation was complete. I wasn't the little sister anymore. I was the sharpest mind in the room. Mr. Henderson tried to argue that the zoning violation was a minor clerical error. He was smooth, using big words to hide weak arguments. But I had done the work. I had read the footnotes he thought I'd skip. "Counselor," I interrupted him mid-sentence, "turn to page 42 of the exhibit, the Environmental Impact Survey." He fumbled with his papers. "The survey is dated 3 months after construction began. That's not a clerical error. That is a violation of State Code 11B. Your motion to dismiss is denied." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Bang! I saw Vanessa flinch at the sound. It was the sound of her husband losing a fortune, and the sound of her losing control.
Court is adjourned. The final crack of the gavel felt different this time. It wasn't just closing a session, it was closing a chapter of my life that had dragged on for far too long. I stood up. The room rose with me in a rustle of fabric and shuffling feet. I gathered my files, stacking them neatly on the corner of the bench. I could feel Vanessa's eyes burning into me. I glanced down one last time. She was slumped in her chair, her expensive white coat looking rumpled, her face a mask of conflict. She looked like she wanted to run, but she also looked like she wanted to wave, to catch my eye, to mouths, "I'm sorry," or more likely, "Can you fix this?" I didn't give her the chance. I turned my gaze to Officer Miller, the bailiff who had stood stoically by the bench throughout the entire ordeal. "Officer Miller," I said, my voice carrying just enough for the front row to hear. "Yes, Your Honor?" He stepped forward. I reached into the deep pocket of my black robe and pulled out the crumpled $20 bill. I smoothed it out against the polished wood of the bench. Harriet Tubman's face stared back at me. weary but resolute. "I believe there is a donation jar for the public defender's legal aid fund in the break room?" I asked. Officer Miller looked at the bill, then at the stunned woman in the front row, and finally back at me. A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, ma'am, there is." "Please add this to it," I said, handing him the money. It was a generous tip provided by a member of the public who wanted to support the court's staff. "I'll make sure it gets there, Your Honor." I didn't look at Vanessa again. I didn't need to. I turned and descended the steps, the hem of my robe sweeping the floor. I walked through the heavy oak door and let it click shut behind me, sealing out the whispers, the stares, and the sister who had never bothered to know who I really was. Back in the quiet of my chambers, I unzipped the heavy robe and hung it back on the rack. I smoothed down my beige blazer. I was just Catherine again, but as I picked up my briefcase and headed for the exit, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The beige suit didn't look invisible anymore. It looked like the armor of a woman who didn't need to shout to be heard.